这是王德发的财经笔记，这里能帮你快速找到资讯价值点。今天和大家分享一下霍德华·马克思最近关于贸易战对投资者的影响，其中明确了一类投资项目的确定性。另外，他还重点提醒了投资者，当下贸易战的核心逻辑是什么。马克思还提示了当下的美股还不能确定当下就是底部。各位小伙伴先仔细听听，视频的末尾有我对他的核心观点的总结，供大家参考和交流，希望对大家的投资决策有所帮助。另外，未来海外的银行账号以及港美股账号越来越严格了，附图长桥华盛通，有需求的抓紧开，新人1000元开户红包奖励，来我首页的电报群可以全部搞定。
Mark's joined us on a day of turmoil after putting out a memo about a month ago where he wrote, "The bottom line is that credit presently offers a better deal than equities. Even at today's spreads, credit isn't a giveaway today, but it offers a healthy absolute returns and is fairly priced." Howard joins us right now. Howard, you wrote that a month ago. The world has changed. We have seen the market sell off. We have seen tariffs implemented that are the highest levels that we've seen going back 100 years. Does your thesis still hold?
The yields on credit are still very healthy, and in fact, credit yields a little more now than it did 6 weeks ago when I wrote that memo. Then high-yield bonds, for example, were yielding around 7.2. Today, they're close to 8, which means they went down in price, producing a higher prospective return. Of course, the stock market is well down since then. I don't know, 15, 16, 17%. I haven't done the math yet, and it keeps moving. But, obviously, the state of the world, which equity prices depend on, is completely in flux and has been radically changed. Most investors think for the worse. That's why prices are down. The question, of course, is whether they're down too much, just right, or not enough, and almost nobody can say.
How do you start to even measure something like a potential paradigm shift, like the tariffs that were announced earlier this week?
Well, first of all, of course, measure is the wrong word because that suggests some quantification, which is impossible. There's nothing to measure. But how do you gauge? How do you think about the changes? And this is the biggest change in the environment that I've seen probably in my career. We've gone from free trade or world trade and globalization system, which implies significant restrictions on trade in every direction, and a step toward isolation for the United States. I believe that the last 80 years since World War II have been the best economic period in the history of mankind, and one of the major reasons was the growth of trade. And I think that we have truly had a rising tide that lifted all boats, and trade was a big part of that. And everybody in the audience should understand the role of trade. Every country, for example, does some things better and worse. And worldwide welfare is maximized when every country does the things it does best and cheapest, and then sells them to the countries that need them, which do other things and sell them to other people. That's how trade works. And, well, I don't know if it's politically correct, but the good news is that the Italians make the pasta and the Swiss make the watches. But if we stop world trade and the Swiss have to make their own pasta and the Italians have to make their own watches, the world will probably be, well, maybe arguably people in both countries will be a little worse off. That's what we're talking about here. And we should not underestimate the benefits that we've gotten from globalization. And among other things, there was a 25-year period, which I cited in one of my memos 10 years ago, in which the cost of durables in the U.S. went down by 40% in inflation-adjusted terms. That kept a lid on inflation here. It made goods available cheaply to all Americans. If we don't have world trade, we don't have that benefit. And, the tariffs are designed to encourage production at home, but who could imagine that most things produced in the United States will be as cheap as they are coming from abroad. In other words, things will cost more.
If that's the case, does that mean that you see the inflationary regime as being something that is more persistent, or a reversal of what we saw, the disinflation of the globalization?
Well, I think so. There were financial benefits from globalization, including keeping a lid on inflation. And, you know, if we hadn't bought our TV sets and appliances from abroad in that 25-year period at declining prices, what would inflation have been? And the answer is considerably more. Maybe not 2, but maybe 3, 4, 5. And so, tariffs are an increased cost. Somebody has to pay them. And, most people think the consumer will pay them. There's some possibility that the importer or the exporter will pay them, or the government of the exporting country. But it's an increased cost, the proceeds from which will go to the government. And, will society be better off as a result?
When you're measuring how to decide the risk and reward of given asset classes in this type of environment that could go in a multitude of different ways, how do you understand where there's value, what a return is that would justify a risk at a time when, potentially you could get 7%, 8%, 9% with credit? With stocks, they have delivered more than 10% for the past number of decades. But going forward?
I want to respond first to your last sentence. Stocks have delivered an average of 10% a year for the last 100 years, but not when the PE ratio was 19. And the PE ratio today is probably 19. The average return has been 16. So we can say that when the PE ratio averages 16, the return average is 10. But when the PE ratio is 19, my guess is, if you look at history, if you bought the S&P when the PE ratio was 19, historically you probably made, let's say, 1 to 6% a year, or 2 to 7% a year, something like that, but certainly not 10. And so, what you pay matters, and the price of the S&P is elevated relative to historic levels, so you shouldn't expect historic returns.
Whereas in credit, one of your arguments is you can expect to get that return because the default risk isn't as great as some of the excess spreads and what you're getting in all-in yields.
Well, with credit is a newfangled word for fixed income, which was a newfangled word for bonds. In 1978, I was moved at Citibank from the equities department to the bond department. Nobody talked about fixed income or credit. But with debt, or bonds, or fixed income, or credit, what you see is what you get. You can read on the piece of paper what the promised return is, and then the only thing you have to wonder about is, will I get it? That is to say, will the issuer default, or will they keep their promises? And by the way, they promise you interest, they promise you to pay your money back at the end, and if they don't keep the promise, they lose the company. So they have a lot of incentives to pay. I've been in non-investment grade credit for 47 years, and in our experience, roughly 99% of our issuers have paid as promised.
You've thrived during your 5-decade career, almost 5-decade career, during times of dislocation. Is this a time of dislocation to play or not to?
Well, it's a time of dislocation. Everybody has to judge for themselves whether the asset prices so far is right. If it's excessive, you should jump in with both feet. If it's inadequate, you should wait until things adjust further. And it's impossible to make that judgment qualitatively. You used the word measure before. I pushed back a little bit. There's no place you can look. There's no analysis you can do to determine whether today's asset prices are right for the environment ahead. Now, there never is. It's always conjecture. It's always guesswork. That's, in theory, why the greatest investors are great, because they make those judgments better than most people. It's excessively hard today because today we have no idea what the future is going to be. Normally, we think we know what's going to happen in the future. We normally assume the future will look mostly like the past. We extrapolate. And usually it works because the world doesn't change that much. But the world economy and the world order beyond economy, meaning geopolitics and international relationships, has been shook up like a snow globe by the events of the last days. And nobody knows what it's going to look like. Nobody knows. I dare say, if you tell me that what our rules will be 6 months ago, 6 months from now, I'll bet you're wrong. This is in flux. And if you think it's in flux, then by definition, you don't know what the future holds. And then even if you know what our country's going to do, and it's going to be that way 6 months from now, we don't know what other countries are going to do, what the ramifications will be. So, I always inveigh against forecasting. I don't believe in macro forecasting, my own or other people's. And we know much less today than usual. Now, people who like to run their lives according to forecasts, they say, well, this is going to happen in the future, so I'm going to do this, and this is going to happen in the future, so I'm going to do that. What you really need, if you like to work with forecasts, is you need two things. Not just a forecast. You need the forecast, but you need an estimate of the probability that your forecast is correct. And today, whatever your forecast may be, you have to say, the probability that I'm right is lower than ever, because the probability that we know what the future is going to look like is lower than ever. And that's how I feel.
Is this a time to be fearful or greedy?
You know, what you have to say, Bloomberg's offices, you have to think in terms of your neighbor, the department store.
Bloomingdale's.
Bloomingdale's just put everything on sale. Prices have come down for the S&P, 8% in the last 2 days, and much more in the last 6 weeks. It's on sale. That should encourage people to think about buying. Will they go down further? Nobody knows. Are the prices fair? Nobody knows. But everybody runs from the market when prices go down because they think it connotes risk. It's just stuff going on sale. And, of course, it takes, well, I was going to say a pro, but it takes a prescient pro, of which there aren't many, to know whether, as I keep saying, the discounts are adequate or appropriate. But certainly you have to look, and it doesn't make any sense to say, just a minute, I did X, Y, Z when the price was 100. Today the price is 90, so I'm going to boycott it. That doesn't make any sense on its face. You have to take a hard look.
Do you still think that the U.S. is the best place to invest?
I think it's probably still the best place, but it's less best than it used to be. You know, if you think about the things that made it the best place, one of them was the rule of law. That may be less the fact today. One of them was the predictability of outcomes. That may be less today. One of them was the worst thing about investing in the United States for many years has been our fiscal situation, our deficits and debts. And the U.S. has behaved like somebody who has a golden credit card where there's no credit limit and the bill never comes. So, of course, you can spend more than you make. And if somebody has a golden credit card, well, what would you do? Well, you might buy a nice car, but what the hell, you might as well buy all the cars because the bill's not going to come. And that's the way we've behaved. And that's the way Washington has spent money. But can the events of the recent days change that? Can they cause there to be a credit limit? Can they cause a bill to be presented at some point in time? And if the answer to either or both of those questions is yes, that's a real risk. If people don't like the dollar, don't like investing in the United States, don't want to hold an unlimited number of treasuries, if we just make people mad and say the U.S. is still a great credit, but I don't want to hold their debts because look how they're treating me, the fiscal situation will be very complicated.
我们来总结一下，作为投资者，当前有3个关键趋势，我们必须认清。贸易政策影响深远，当下对未来的可知性比过往任何时候都更低。现在的关税政策不再是短期干扰因素，而是彻底改变全球供应链格局的决定性因素。在这种不确定的贸易环境下，股权投资确实面临较大波动风险。全球化红利正在消失，信贷投资收益更具有确定性。以往通过全球分工控制通胀的模式已经行不通了，现在供应链区域化可能成为新常态。这要求我们重新评估制造业的成本结构。在这种背景下，信贷投资可能比股票更有吸引力。比如目前高收益债券收益率已经达到 8% 左右，而同期股市下跌了 15% 到 17%， 标普500的市盈率依然处于高位，预示着未来股票回报可能不太乐观。这里还隐藏着一个重要趋势，本土制造业短期内确实会受益于关税保护，但长期来看可能会面临效率下降的问题。此外，全球化退潮将推高美国进口商品价格，打破过去几十年的低通胀格局，这是我们需要警惕的。美国经济存隐忧，持续的财政赤字和债务问题可能动摇美元信用基础，同时政策的不确定性增加，也在降低美国作为投资目的地的吸引力。